Good afternoon, and thank you very much, dear colleagues, for this kind invitation to university for this very important conference. I'm very delighted and honored to be here. As already mentioned this morning, the discovery of energy, of hydrocarbons in the Eastern Mediterranean has added a further international dimension to the Cyprus issue. And those discoveries, of course, can both reinforce or scuttle the ongoing political stalemate. So, by the way, and as already mentioned, going to go fast on that point, after 2 years of work, the negotiations for a reunification of Cyprus held in Switzerland at the Crans-Montana Alpine Station under the aegis of the United Nations, as usual, in July 2017, failed again. By the way, this round of negotiations was considered as one of the most promising and likely to end the division of the islands, and UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said he was deeply disappointed when he saw it as a historical opportunity, may I say, one more historical opportunity. So, in summary and in general, and starting from there, the discovery of gas in the Eastern Mediterranean raises great hopes, but also, as mentioned this morning, generates tensions. So that the question of the prospects of settlement of the Cyprus conflict remains raised in a renewed context in front of a separation that has become quite effective after decades of negotiations. So let me come back, if you allow, to this, what I call an effective separation of the two parts of the island, even if it's still considered by the international community in general that the establishment of a new legal framework for Cyprus would be a sufficient condition for the removal of differences of opinions, of differences of point of views. On the contrary, and it was also mentioned this morning, the history of the negotiations has often shown that any new institutional system could embrace tensions and antagonism, whereas the de facto separation has, on the contrary, preserved up to now a kind of peace, even if this morning also our distinguished colleague, dealt with the status quo and felt that it had to stop now. Anyway, the failure of the negotiations for up to 50 years, as also already mentioned a few times, is not unrelated, of course, is not unrelated to the failure of the 1960 institutional system. So let me come back a few moments on this institutional system, if you allow. And when dealing with the Cyprus issue, you know, of course, better than I do. I'm totally aware of the fact that I'm an external element today. Anyway, when dealing with this issue, it is necessary to decide where to place or when to place its starting point. And in this respect, it seems that the logical starting point seems to be the establishment of the Republic of Cyprus in 1960, following the London and Zurich agreements. Nevertheless, other parameters like geostrategic parameters have also to taken account. So the United Kingdom granted independence in 1960, and as raised by Lawrence Durrell, the British administration would have been able to be analysed as a so-called route sans faute, how would you say in English? Route without fault, if it had resulted in self-determination. So shortly, Cypriots have become independent without having experienced the transition of internal autonomy, and they were confronted with the implementation of a constitution which was in a kind of way prepared without them. And clearly, it would have taken a lot of diplomacy and political will to make such an institutional system work. The specificity of the functioning of the 1960 statute alone does not explain its failure. Alone does not explain its failure less than 4 years after its establishment. It is also the political, the sociological context of its implementation, the aspirations of the governors that constitute maybe the main factor of instability of the island after independence. As somebody said in the doctrine, a constitution is only a carcass. A constitution is only a carcass. It is the actions of its rulers that may personify it. However, the editors of the 1960 Cypriot Constitution were aware of the fact that they had put in place a quite complex institutional system, which moved from the federal option, which might have enshrined a partition of the island, it was said at that time, while excluding a strictly majority system, because this latter solution is only effectively operational and democratic if there is a common, and it was said this morning as well, if there is a common political goal within the state, the basis of which lies in basic political equality, or at least in equal opportunities for all citizens. This was not verified in Cyprus, and especially when the president proposed in 1963 the 13-point plan. And this point plan, of course, jeopardized the situation of the Turkish Cypriot community. And the publication of the plan for constitutional reforms triggered a phase of violence between the two communities. It was also in 1963, and it has to be remembered, that the Makarios government was internationally recognized by the United Nations and by third countries. So the legitimization of the Republic of Cyprus as a result of those historical events would therefore raise a problem within the meaning of public international law, as long as, and as Christian Heinze, you mentioned him yesterday, as Christian Heinze pointed out, taking possession of the authority throughout the territory in accordance with the principle of effectiveness, is not realized. So the de facto separation between both parts thus enabled some to consider, rightly, some authors to consider, that the solution of the Cyprus issue in the future could only be based on, first, it was said, the recognition of a kind of status quo, but anyway, a situation which excluded a return to the 1960 agreements. By the way, started what was also mentioned, a kind of never-ending negotiation system. Those are not my words, and of course the failure of the Geneva negotiations have to be placed back in this never-ending negotiations system. In 2005, Mr. Rolandis, foreign minister, resigned from President Kyprianou, denounced after the failure of the summit meeting in New York a mechanism of endless negotiations in an open letter to the agreed Cypriot president. And he wrote, "Why don't you accept the Secretary General's draft agreement as a continuing agenda and thus avoid severe confrontation with the big parties? Is it that you are frightened and that by avoiding the term agreement you are opting for the never-ending negotiations that require neither responsibility nor difficult decision? You want nothing but negotiation," said. "You have no right to play on the future of Cyprus." So it's true that it was also remembered this morning, it's true that in 2004 the Greek Cypriot community rejected by referendum the peace plan proposed by Kofi Annan, who was then Secretary General. But this failure as well must also, I think, be put in context again. Because mid-November 2002, judging the political timetable quite favorable, the Secretary General presented to the Security Council the plan, the 137-page plan for an institutional settlement for Cyprus. And the agenda of the Annan plan was also a response to the timetable for the accession of the Republic of Cyprus to the European Union. So the plan was a failure, as everybody knows, and some observers saw at that time, even if some observers saw at that time a new historic opportunity, while others saw it as well as a last chance. At best, maybe it was a kind of start. Indeed, the Cypriot president expressed his mixed feeling about the outcome of the plan. So, as this missed opportunity recalls other missed opportunities, the one of 1972, also referred to as a Swiss model, or the one of 1977, maybe demonstrating a kind of lack of urgency of a settlement. So as mentioned during the introduction of this conference, after 50 years of failed negotiations, the discovery of gas gives a new international dimension to the issue and creates, of course, kind of tensions. Anyway, up to now, the international community has defended or has opted for an unchanged position. which has now to face a risk of disruption of regional balances in the Eastern Mediterranean. Let's come back first to this traditional position of the international community, if you allow. In front of the Cyprus problem, the international community has had to try to reconcile two major principles of public international law. One of them was already mentioned, it's self-determination, and the other one is territorial integrity, the respect of territorial integrity of states in general. So the second one, territorial integrity of states, has been put by the international community, has been put forward so as not to hinder as far as possible the negotiation process, and it was said, and to avoid any dislocation of the Cypriot state as conceived in 1960. And due to this traditional position of the international community, of course, the independence of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus in 1983 was thus always condemned and called secession of a pre-existing state. And the Republic of Cyprus continues to be identified with the 1960 institutions in the absence of the completion of the current negotiation, even though the functioning of the 1960 institution is no longer, as we all know, is no longer in line with the founding principles of 1960. However, let's come back to Charles de Vicher. However, as Charles de Vicher pointed out years ago, I'm just telling what he said. Faced with the extreme mobility of international relations, of present, in our case, international relations, some states are reluctant to engage too much in the way of recognitions, to grant a label whose political consequences seem risky to them. This political concern inclines them to overcome the traditional criterion of effectiveness. And that's, I think, a quite important point. The effectiveness, not only of the separation, but the effectiveness of the functioning of the institution of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. And if you take into account effectiveness, you cannot, as some do, you cannot just say, okay, the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, is, for example, a puppet state, or as a protectorate, or more generally, a territory under international administration. You have to take into account the effectiveness of the functioning. And may I just remember, in relation with this point, one decision of the European Court of Human Rights in the Lloyd-Seedou versus Turkey case. Of course, in the Lloyd-Seedou case, the European Court of Human Rights concluded that the continued denial of the applicant's access to a property in Northern Cyprus and the resulting loss of it to her is a matter within Turkey's jurisdiction. But she notes, the court, however, that it's not necessary to determine whether, as the applicant and the Cypriot government are progressing, Turkey actually exercises control over the policy and actions of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. It's not necessary, said the court. And in his dissenting opinion, Justice Petiti also stated that the problem of the two communities, he said, the problem of the two communities as a whole is more a matter of politics and diplomacy than a European judicial review based on the isolated situation of Mrs. Lotsidou under Protocol number 1 of the Convention. So this case law thus appeared only as a kind of partial solution or contribution to the issue. And by the way, jurisprudence in general has been only partially remediating. So has to be mentioned as well another case, the case law Cyprus versus Turkey 2001, once again. The case law Cyprus versus Turkey 2001 of the European Court of Human Rights was also perceived, of course, a factor of political tension. The context was that time a interstate request, and the court confirmed the extraterritorial scope of Turkey's obligations under the European Convention on Human Rights. But in a somewhat, I should say, paradoxical way, the court answered yes the questions of whether the courts of the northern part of the island could be considered internal remedies whose prior exhaustion is required. So this point, which is a kind of source of confusion, had to be pointed out. I won't come back to the European Court on Human Rights judgment of May 2014. And concerning the cases brought to the Court of Justice of the European Union, well, this jurisprudence only suggests a partial response, mid-response to the problem posed by the free movement of goods, thus recalling, of course, or reminding the difficulties of application of law in a politically sensitive situation. In summary, the primary concern to preserve stability in the Eastern Mediterranean has, some kind of way, outweighed a reality that has been consolidating since 1963. And let's come back to Charles de Vichy once again, if you allow. The fact that the Cypriot issue is now revived by tensions in the Eastern Mediterranean because of the gas deposits discovered should not, however, make us forget this formula of Charles de Vichy, which perfectly reconciles straight and common sense. He said, the duration clears the mediating function of effectiveness by lightening up two, in appearance, contradictory maxims. Ex injuria jus non oritur and jus facto oritur. In other words, the consequences of as interpreted as such, of an illegal event in its origin, when it reaches an undeniable level of effectiveness, can give rise to a new situation in law. What impact will the new energy configuration in the Eastern Mediterranean have in this respect? So I won't come back to the pipelines and other discoveries. It was so well presented this morning. Let me just add that the interest of the European powers is obvious, allowing them to diversify and secure their energy supply. And this energy reconfiguration in the Eastern Mediterranean also partly explains the resumption, as sponsored by the European Union, the starting again of the negotiation in 2014, the whole having failed. And this overall context, which once again questions the future, is not without reminding the political correlation between the Annan Plan, the UN Annan Plan, and the negotiation for the accession of the Republic of Cyprus to the European Union. So it should be noted, if you allow in conclusion, that the interests modeled in a more than complex, fragile compromise in 1960 could not easily ensure the viability of the institutional system which was created at that time. The management of the Cyprus issue has thus illustrated a constant tension between law and fact, a continuation negotiation process without success, without real success, sponsored by unconditional support from the international community. So the near or distant future may learn from this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.